Hello and welcome back to the Fundamentally Fit podcast with me, your host, Andy Strong, and a very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to wherever it is that you are tuning into this week's podcast. It's 2020, it's January. Happy New Year ahead, and a brand new decade ahead as well. But if you're not tuning into this podcast in January, because hey, it is a podcast, then I hope your year is going really well. And if you're tuning in and it's not even 2020 anymore, then I am way back in the past. But I hope some of the things I'm going to talk about today and in this series actually came to fruition, became useful, and something that you can reflect on and still find useful. Now, this isn't just the first podcast of 2020 and the new decade, but it's also the first podcast in a series of 3. So as I mentioned in the podcast back before Christmas, back last decade, I am going to be releasing a series of different podcasts on different topics, going into subject matter in more detail, exploring it more than the surface level things that I've only had time to in the podcast before. Now, we're kicking off with something that's fairly topical. We're going to be talking over the next 3 podcasts about plant-based diets, nutrition, veganuary, environmental impacts of meat, and we're also going to be talking about a little bit about some of the ethical factors behind that as well. Today, we're going to be talking more specifically about your diet or your planet, and the big push at the moment, particularly as it is veganuary, for people to make the switch to reducing their meat consumption and switching to a more plant-based driven diet. I'm going to be asking the question, is this a realistic approach for the masses in the UK in particular, because that is where we are based? And we're going to be exploring some of the reasons why I think that is going to be particularly challenging, and how, if you are someone that is looking to do this, how you can take advantage of some of the more sensible, more balanced approaches that I have been using with clients trying to make lifestyle change over the last 10 years in the industry, 6 years this year of running Fundamentally Fit. Episode number 2, we're going to leave the ethical and the environmental to one side. And episode number 2, we're going to look at some of the important factors behind having a balanced plant-based diet. Some of the things you need to make sure that you're getting right, some of the things you need to look out for, and how to make sure you are optimizing your health should you choose to follow one of these types of diets, to make sure that you are getting all of the things you need to be fit, happy, and healthy into the years ahead. Finally, episode number 3, we're going to be looking at plant-based nutrition and its impact on sporting performance. This particular episode, we're going to be talking about the documentary that has been positively filling my social media channels since the tail end of last year, and still is today, to be perfectly honest, and that is the Netflix documentary Game Changers. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on that particular documentary today, but what I will say is that it is, of all of the Netflix documentaries, of which there are quite a few, most of which I take quite serious umbrage with for various reasons. This one is slick. It's very watchable. There are a number of issues around it that we'll talk about in the podcast. But it's very well put together, and it raises some interesting points. So we're going to talk about that in episode number 3. We're kicking the year off with this particular topic because it's veganuary, and it is something that's being talked about a lot right now. The climate crisis, everything else. This is very, very current in people's minds. And in my personal opinion, this is just my personal opinion, I think this will be one of the most hotly debated topics of the next decade, unquestionably, whether you're looking at it from an environmental position, the growing people that are pushing it from an ethical standpoint, and importantly, how that impacts on the masses, our farming, climate change, and how people are trying to optimize good health and nutrition into the future to try and make sure that they are looking after themselves as we all become more mindful of the things that we eat and drink. So all of those things being said, we're going to jump into this podcast in just a moment, but one other thing I just want to kind of say, whenever somebody like myself, and you'll notice there is not masses of content on my website about plant-based nutrition, there is some. One of the reasons for that is because the topics and the conversations around this tend to get very heated very quickly. There are deeply passionate and closely held views, whether they be environmental, ethical, or just people wanting to improve their health. But around this particular topic, people can get very, very kind of animated in the discussions and not always in a way that's constructive for everybody. Even today, over on Ben Coomber's website, I noticed that, or his social media channels, I noticed he had to put a video up explaining that he's not actually anti-vegan, but just some of the content he's been putting out, he's trying to help people understand how to balance out their diet, and he's not saying people should or shouldn't eat in a certain way. So if you have questions, please pop them down below. If you're on the website or on social media, please drop me questions over andy@fundamentallyfit.co.uk if you've got things you'd like me to cover, either to talk about in things that I've said in this podcast or things that I'm going to be saying or come up in the next couple of podcasts. Happy to answer those. But please, if you are in conversation on any of the social media channels, keep it respectful, because this is something that's not going to be going away, and it's something we need to have a much broader, a much more open conversation with everybody, so that people can find the middle ground and the place that feels right for them, for their health, for the future, and for the planet, because this is something that actually genuinely motivates a lot of people for the right reasons. So 6 minutes of intro waffle. We're going to jump into today's actual podcast, and it's your diet or your planet, and that's kind of what I've titled it, because right now in Veganuary, and I use Veganuary, I'm not really just talking about vegans. I'm actually talking about plant-based diets, or diets that are most predominantly driven by that plant-based factor. Now, right now, because it is January, and this is very much stolen the march, or has the momentum behind it for 2020's big dietary push that we see each year, there is a lot of media, particularly certain TV channels, that are heavily pushing the importance of reducing meat intake for environmental factors. Many are choosing to leave some of the more, challenging ethical factors to one side. So how our meat is produced in the UK, how it's produced in Europe. Often we see how meat is produced in America, and obviously the standards can be quite varying between all of those different places. Many of the outlets tend to leave that alone, and they're actually pushing quite hard on the environmental. Now, for me, I don't want to get too bogged down on the ethical side. We're going to touch on the environmental today, but what I'm really interested in, because I'm not an activist, I'm not a climate scientist, I am a nutrition coach, and I am a fitness professional. So I want to help people get the best balance in their diet. I want them to get the best balance in their overall lifestyle, whatever diet they feel works best for them. And for whatever reason that is, it's none of my business. It's not something that I have a motivation either way. I just want them to get the best out of their diet. So I don't want to get too dragged down that particular road, but there is a lot of this in the media right now, and it's a real big push on the environmental side. And I think a lot of that is because the media channels feel more comfortable with that message, because it aligns more closely with the climate crisis. We've had all the Extinction Rebellion here in London and across the UK over the last year, and I think they see more synergy there and kind of momentum with that particular angle of the story than maybe focusing too heavily on the ethical side, which I think they feel resonates with less people. So those are just my thoughts on that. Now, interestingly, I've been reading, I say interestingly, this was a mammoth of a document. I've been reading I'm going to have to read this out because I can't remember the whole title. The UN Assessing the Environmental Impacts of Consumption and Production study. It's a whopper, and I'm not going to lie, it's quite dry. And now, obviously, we don't have time to go through this whole report. I'll link it up down below. Please, if you are passionate and you're interested about this as a topic, go and read that report. It will take you some time. It's very well put together. It's very readable for the type of document that it is, but it will give you some genuine background as to where we are as a global community without agenda. And I think that's always a good thing. Now, I've picked out three key things which we're going to talk about to kick this off. They're actually they're in the preface. They're actually early on in this particular document, but they fit quite nicely with what we're talking about today, and I think they sum up the environmental position quite succinctly. So first off, and I'm reading this from the report, so we know from previous research that a doubling of wealth leads to 80% higher CO2 emissions. So population predictions for 2050 make this more urgent. So this first part of the study and the kind of the preface setting out their case argues that as our wealth goes up as a global community, we emit more emissions. And one of the arguments you will see from lots of plant-based and vegan campaigners is the requirement for more farming land, more agricultural land, because the more wealth we have and the more countries that become more wealthy, the more they're eating beef, and then we're eating more pork, and then obviously you have the emissions that come from that. And of course there is a trade element to this as well, as we ship this food and livestock from different parts of the world. It has to get there, and that creates CO2 emissions and kind of contributes to that environmental impact as well. The next part to this that I kind of picked out is as follows. So presently, production of internationally traded goods vital to economic growth account for approximately 30% of CO2 emissions. And this is important because it's not just the food that we eat. That food has to be transported. The grain, the feed that feeds the livestock has to be transported. We are a global community that relies on trade, and completely aside from what we are talking about today in terms of the environment and meat and plant-based diets, I feel this is something that is perhaps not spoken about as much in the climate argument, because we trade with all of our neighbours across the world, or many of them, and Brexit will certainly open up new opportunities potentially, but that also has potentially a impact on environment, and without more green ways to transport goods of every kind, that potentially has an impact on the environment as well. Now, the final part to this, which I kind of wanted to pick out before we get started on my thoughts, is this. Agricultural production accounts for a staggering 70% of global freshwater consumption, which I have to be perfectly honest, I double highlighted this and underlined it because that one really surprised me. 38% of total land use and 14% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So if we compare our internationally traded goods, which are vital to economic growth, account for 30% of global emissions, and then agriculture accounting for around 14%. So there's a big difference there, and obviously part of that trade will be made up of some of that, some of the agricultural emissions, and obviously that being moved around. But it's certainly undeniable that there's an impact there. Now, you can go through this study in more detail, and I'm sure people will be screaming other studies at me as I say this, but there's quite a clear case that our meat consumption and our global meat consumption is something that's having an impact, but it is unquestionably one factor in a whole vast array of complex reasons as to why we are damaging the environment. Now, yes, you can have the argument that changing your diet will be doing your bit. You can also have the argument that countries like China, India should be doing more, and that as a small country, does changing your diet have an impact? And the answer to that realistically is not a huge impact, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do your part if you feel that you should. And this is really where we start to get to the crux of where I think this kind of movement reaches a challenging intersection, because there is absolutely nothing wrong with feeling like you want to do your part and improve the health of the planet, reduce greenhouse gases, reduce your meat consumption, reduce demand, and there's nothing wrong with that. And actually this week, so just take me a moment to pull this up because my phone is being a pain, but even this weekend I was reading in the newspaper, it was a report, I think it was in the Eye, from Nielsen, talking about the Brits as a whole and how they've actually been reducing their meat consumption. So beef and pork producers. So more than 800,000 Britons cut back on eating animal products for at least a month last year. Sales of red meat fell by £185 million in the past 12 months, more than any other supermarket category, according to Nielsen. And that was reported Saturday, I believe, in the Eye newspaper. So people are cutting back is having an impact on that sector. It's having an impact on the amount that we're eating. So yes, you may be one person, but collectively we all make a difference, and we all make a difference in our own way. So that's fine if that's something that you want to do and it feels important to you. Where I think we have the challenge is some, and I admit absolutely not all, but some plant-based advocates can be quite assertive in their suggestion that people should make this switch to plant-based or a fully vegan diet. And their reasons are fair, their reasons are fully justifiable to them, but they meet the very real problem and the very real challenge that actually most people aren't very good at making these types and this level of lifestyle change. And so this is where I want to park the more technical side. So, the UN study is there. Please feel free to click the link and go and have a look. I've shared a few thoughts on where I think, trade and some of the ethical kind of issues are. I also have kind of outlined why I think that the media is pushing the environmental side more than the ethical. I can't really say any more than that because, as I mentioned, I believe right at the very start, I'm not an environmental scientist. I am not an animal rights activist. I am a fitness professional and I am a nutrition coach, and I want my clients to pick the diet that they feel fits their lifestyle for whatever reason, and that they do it well and they do it in a way that they can sustain for the longest time possible to impact their health of both them and their friends and their family around them. That's the only reason I'm in the industry. So I have no agenda. If you're interested as to what my dietary persuasion is, I would class myself as flexitarian. So I do eat some meat, but particularly over the last couple of years, I have shifted heavily towards a more plant-based diet. So, I'm not going to lie, there are some bias within what I'm saying here, but that's being completely open at the outset. That's how I feel about the situation. I actually really like eating a plant-based diet because it makes me feel good. I enjoy eating lighter meals. It's relatively fast to cook. I enjoy cooking, and so it works really well for me and for my wife. But I do also enjoy meat and some animal products, and I still include those in my weekly and monthly diet, with it still being predominantly driven by plant-based food sources. So that being said, we have this situation where people, rightly, if they feel strongly enough, would like to adopt a plant-based diet or a vegan diet to reduce their impact on the environment, improve their health, and feel better. Now, parking the other two to one side, it's a very noble thing to want to change your diet to reduce the impact on the environment and potentially for ethical reasons too. However, there is nothing wrong with that, but it comes up against a very, very big and a very, very real challenge. And having spent 6 years this year in Fundamentally Fit, 10 years in the industry since I first qualified and started working with people. During that time, I have learned that it takes a lot for people to make that level of change. And I have seen people in that time who want to change their lifestyle and kind of overhaul their diet for an absolute multitude of reasons. So it might be that, they've had a health scare. Maybe they want to be a better role model to their kids. They want to, look fantastic on their wedding day. They want to have more energy to get more from life. There can be all of these different reasons coming off medication. They might be getting over surgery. But whatever these different reasons are, they're always important and they're always very, very personal. And changing your diet for the environment, very noble, very understandable reason, but I don't feel that it outweighs some of the very deep personal reasons that I see on a daily basis from clients that come through my door. And one of the things that I see regularly, or is very common, is that the clients that come see me struggle with a few of the very, very similar issues. So they often have poor cooking skills. Particularly it's something we don't value as much as we should, particularly in 2020, something I've talked about on the podcast before. It's a core fundamental skill that a lot of people don't have, and a lot of people don't have very much confidence with. Often those that can cook or have some basic cooking skills often don't have a repertoire of healthy food and healthy meals that they're confident and comfortable cooking and enjoy eating to maintain a healthy routine longer than maybe a week or two. And often they're one or two different things they've picked up through, slimming groups or previous diets or books and things, but it's never really very coherent and together. I often see people that don't have very much time to eat while they're at work, so they don't actually take a fixed lunch break, so they work through, meaning that their food choices are often very erratic, or it's things that they can grab in a petrol station or a service station because they're dashboard dining as they drive up and down the country. I see people that struggle to have a structured mealtime in the evening with either their family or with their partners, and so often coming in late, meaning that they're much more likely to dial in off of their favorite delivery app. And then, lastly, but not by any means least, and very fundamental to the topic we're talking about today, I see lots and lots of people that just struggle and fail to get anywhere near their 5-a-day fruits and veg. And of the two, it's much more common to see people getting some fruit or more fruit, but little or no regular, consistent intake of vegetables. Veg intake is hands down one of the hardest to achieve. Now, if we consider that a plant-based diet done well, delivering the health benefits and the kind of, the nutrients that you need to be fit, happy and healthy, requires you to eat a well-balanced plant-based diet. And that means whole foods. So you should be having lots of fruits and vegetables, good quality sources of proteins, so pulses, nuts, lentils. It should be, depending on the type of plant-based diet you're having, it may mean some sources of dairy to make sure you're getting your vitamin C, making sure you're getting adequate amounts of calcium. It's going to mean eating a lot of the green veg, particularly, that most people don't like. So yes, it's time to eat your broccoli. And a lot of people will struggle with these foods. And if you are rushing into this type of diet, I think what I saw last January is a lot of people that will decide, right, I'm going to make this dramatic change. I'm going to do it now. It's for the environment. It's January. I want to feel better. It's the best time to do it. I'm going to throw myself into it, but they don't do much planning. And what happens is you underestimate how much planning and education goes into following a proper plant-based diet, particularly at the outset. And when that happens, it can be very easy to rely on processed meat substitutes. It can be very easy to rely on plant-based and vegan fast foods, which supermarkets are filling that vacuum on our supermarket shelves like really, really quickly. They've recognized there's a growing market. People now often assume that plant-based and vegan is quote unquote healthy by default, something that we've done with, dairy-free, fat-free, high protein. These are things that we see on our labels, and people can often associate with that with being healthy by default, whereas a processed plant-based or vegan food, it's not going to be as healthy as a whole food, and it's really not what this diet is all about. It's really not what this approach is supposed to be all about, and it can be very easy to get into a position where you're maybe technically eating plant-based or vegan, but it's still eating processed foods. And I've been in quite a few plant-based and vegan food groups, and I know that people that are desperate to make this change, and for a multitude of reasons, financial sometimes, and poor cooking skills or poor education, are really not doing it in a very, very good way, and it's unsustainable for them in the long term, which is really sad, because if you want to make this change, you need to do it in a way that is sustainable. Finally, And really importantly is, when I try and help someone change their diet, one of the biggest issues is time, because we are all really time poor. But a proper plant-based diet, done well, done properly, takes time, because you need to learn, you need to build a brand new repertoire of meals that you're happy to cook and eat. Everything you make isn't going to be fantastic, and it's going to take some time to find that balance that works for you. It's also going to take time to cook these meals and to do your batch cooking and get ready to put together a full week. So overhauling your diet overnight is going to be a huge undertaking, and I think I know most people will struggle, because the vast majority of cases where people try to make that level of change, it doesn't last very long, and that means that they may well not return to it in the future. Now, I'm making some semi-sweeping statements here, but I have been in the industry a long time, and I am talking from experience on people that I've worked with, whether it is on these types of diets or similar, where people have made very large amounts of change in very short periods of time, and I know that people struggle to make that sustainable. It's also going to make them feel like they are missing out on certain things, and that is going to have the impact of pulling them back and overcorrecting, and that is always going to end in a challenging way, because they're going to feel like they've compromised their morals if they're doing it for these very specific environmental reasons. So I think, even with the best will in the world, even if someone really wants to make this change, and I think even with the pressure that's coming from media right now that people should be doing this because it's important for the environment, we have the climate crisis, I don't think it's something we can almost bully or pressure people into doing. And actually, I think if you are interested in this type of diet, it would be much better for you to take smaller steps. Plan to have 2 or 3 nights per week where your evening meal is plant-based. Get yourself some plant-based cookbooks, do some proper research and education to make sure that your diet is well balanced. That's something we're going to talk about more in episode number 2 of this series, and make sure that you're trying new ingredients, trying new cooking methods, and kind of making sure that you're bringing your family or your partner with you, so you're not doing this in isolation. And be careful not to get sucked down the route of trying to change your entire life overnight and then getting stuck with a compromise solution that is really a sticking plaster that will mean that you either have a diet that really is not very optimal, or you end up going back to eating the way that you did before. So plan out a few nights each week, really commit to doing that, and do that for as long as you need to build up that repertoire. And then you can, from that position, and you give yourself some time to do additional reading and education, you can then choose, if it's the right thing for you, to transition into a more plant-based diet in your broader diet, if you feel that's the right thing to do. But interestingly and importantly, it will not be the right thing for everyone. And even if a lot of the UK population shifts towards a more plant-based diet, and I think it's important that they do personally, we won't see everybody do that. And we have to find a way to have that conversation with people in a way that is helpful for everyone. Because if someone decides that they can go plant-based maybe 3 or 4 times per week, they're going to reduce their meat consumption by doing so. They're going to reduce their impact. But if at the same time we can encourage them to spend the money that they save on higher welfare meat, it means that the farmers involved are going to get paid more money to look after those animals better. And that's a good thing all round, because it supports our farming community, which we mustn't forget. Regardless of how you feel about eating meat, our farming communities work incredibly hard, and that's one of the hardest sectors in the UK, and they are getting a lot of stick right now, and they are producing the food that we've wanted to eat for a long time, and now that we're changing our mind, we have to make sure we find a way to bring them with us and to support their livelihoods just as much as we're looking to support the planet, because it's really, really important that we don't leave those communities behind. And for those that won't make the full switch, it's a really good thing to be investing in better quality meat, better, higher welfare meat. It means those farmers are going to have the opportunity to still make a good living and actually treat those animals in a way that feels ethically better for more people. Now, I don't want to get dragged down that argument completely because it is a bit of a sidetrack, but I feel that's where we are moving towards. I hope that's where we're moving towards. And I think it's important to say in my opinion, one of the biggest outcomes of this drive towards veganism and plant-based diets in the recent years, and it's not going away. If people think this is a fad, this is not something that will be gone next year. I'm fairly certain of that. Is it has brought plant-based nutrition, and plant-based, really vegetarian is what we would used to think of when we would think about this way of eating, but eating fruit and veg, good quality whole foods, these are things that have always needed to be in your diet, regardless, and we'll talk about that in episode number 2, but it's put that message in people's minds in a way that is much more vivid. We've had report after report about healthy diets. There's one this week about people living healthy lifestyles live 10 years longer. We've had report after report, scientific study after scientific study. The basics of a good healthy diet we've known for a very, very long time. Yet veganism has managed to make people shift the way that they think about those basics, and I know that more people coming through my door are more mindful, more willing to switch some of the foods that they eat, and I would think it would be a great shame if the vegan community missed the massive impact that they have already had on making that happen, because that is not an easy shift to make, and I think as we move forward that will continue to grow. But I do think the level of lifestyle change required, whether it is to a plant-based or a vegan diet as we're talking about here, or similar, is just going to take people a lot more time than perhaps the media and some of the outlets are encouraging it to be. And I think it's worth us all remembering that when we have our online discussions, because everyone is at a different stage of their journey, and journey's end will not be the same for everyone. And I think as long as people are doing their bit for the reasons that feel right for them, we should all respect that. So I know this is a longer podcast today, so thank you for sticking with me to the end. The whole point of these series is that they are meant to be longer, to go deeper on the subject, and I hope that you found today useful. I know much of this is anecdotal, much of this is my experience as a nutrition coach, and that's really where I wanted to drive this. The environmental factors and the ethical factors are very, very important, but they can almost be a sidetrack when we're trying to look at pure lifestyle change and what it takes to change your lifestyle. So those are my thoughts. If you're doing Veganuary, I hope you are finding it useful. I hope you're educating yourself really well. Just a few recommendations if you are. A couple of good books to pick up. Anna Jones is really, really good. She does a lot of vegetarian, which kind of vegetarian and vegan. She gives options for both within her recipe, so she's really cool. Mob Kitchen is not too bad. They're not great on their instructions, so do read the recipes, but the food is pretty good. And Thug Kitchen, random swearing for some reason, but the food is pretty epic. So do check those out if you are doing Veganuary or you want to increase your plant-based vegetarian cooking. If you'd like any help and support with your diets, please feel free to get in touch, andy@fundamentallyfit.co.uk. But I'm going to close out episode number 1. I'll be back here with episode number 2 shortly, and we will be talking about how to put together a plant-based diet. Well, we're going to be talking about the different types of plant-based diets, how they look, how to structure them, and obviously how to make sure you're maximizing your diet for good health, and some of the basics that you need to get right to make sure that you're not going to fall down. And that means that your lifestyle changes can be gradual and sustainable for the future. There's no point making a change for 2 weeks and going back to normal. That doesn't help anyone. You, the planet, the animals, whatever your motivations, 2 weeks does nothing. It just is it's a blip. So that is Andy Strong signing off for the very first podcast of 2020, and I will look forward to seeing you in episode number 2. Hit me up with the questions down below. Hope you've enjoyed this podcast. I will see you all next time.